HOA Karen called 911 to evict me. I arrested her with my own badge. It was supposed to be just another quiet afternoon, until Karen from the HOA stormed up to my front door, phone in hand, shouting about violations. Next thing I know, 911 is being called on me. What she didn't know, I wasn't just a resident, I was the law. And this time, the HOA was messing with the wrong homeowner. It all started on a bright Saturday morning. I had just finished mowing the lawn, something I actually enjoyed doing. It gave me peace and a chance to escape the buzz of daily life. My property was in perfect condition, everything up to code, neat, and well-kept. You couldn't find a single thing out of place, not even a leaf on the sidewalk. I had just leaned back into my chair on the porch, sipping iced tea, when I saw her, Karen, the infamous HOA watchdog, who never missed a chance to insert herself into business that wasn't hers. She came storming across the street, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched too tightly on her face like they were part of her personality. I knew the look before she even opened her mouth. That intense stare, the kind that said she'd already made up her mind and wasn't interested in hearing the truth. Her heels clicked down my walkway like a countdown, and I braced myself. I'd had a few minor run-ins with her before. Notes on my mailbox, passive-aggressive reminders about trash bins. But this time felt different. She was fired up. Without even saying hello, she started snapping pictures of my yard, pointing at the side of the house like she'd found a crime scene. "This is unacceptable," she barked. "You've got an unauthorized structure by your fence line. That's a clear violation." I looked where she was pointing and realized she was talking about the small tool shed I had installed months ago, with full city and HOA approval. I had the paperwork filed, permits signed, and even an email chain with the HOA board giving me the green light. But none of that mattered to Karen. I calmly stood up and asked her what the issue was, offering to show her the documentation. But that only seemed to anger her more. She accused me of being defensive and hiding something, and claimed she had every right to inspect my property. That's when the situation took a sharp turn. She pulled out her phone and, without hesitation, dialed 911. Loud enough for the neighbors to hear, she shouted into the phone that there was a suspicious man trespassing and refusing to leave the property. I was floored. It was my home. My name was on the deed. And now I was being painted as some kind of intruder by a woman who thought a clipboard gave her power. I watched in disbelief as she described me to the dispatcher in loaded terms. Male, agitated, potentially dangerous. Her words weren't just false, they were designed to escalate, to turn an innocent moment into a crisis. Neighbors started peeking through windows and stepping outside, drawn by the drama. Some of them looked concerned, others amused, and a few seemed used to Karen's antics. I tried to reason with her again, telling her she was making a serious mistake, but she waved me off, pacing at the edge of my lawn like she owned the street. It wasn't just arrogance, it was entitlement. She truly believed her role in the HOA gave her the authority to decide who belonged and who didn't. Even when I calmly told her I lived here, that I had every legal right to everything on the property, she just scoffed and doubled down. To her, I was guilty until proven innocent, and she was judge, jury, and executioner. The phone still pressed to her ear. She gave the operator my address, exaggerating every detail to make it sound like a public safety threat. I could hear the words, "Send someone now," and "I don't feel safe." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just Karen being Karen. This was dangerous. A false police report, a weaponized 911 call, and all because her ego couldn't accept that she didn't have the authority she craved. I stood still, keeping my hands visible, knowing exactly how quickly things could go sideways. I'd spent years in law enforcement and had seen too many situations like this end badly. Not because of the truth, but because of how people manipulated perception. Karen was playing with fire, and she had no clue who she was lighting the match against. Karen wasn't content with just filing a complaint or waiting for the HOA board to follow up. No, she needed immediate validation, and calling 911 was her way of asserting power, twisting the situation into her own warped narrative. Her voice rose with each word she spat into the phone, describing me as if I were some trespassing stranger threatening her personal safety. She claimed I had refused to leave the property, that I was loitering near her home, and even went as far as to say she was concerned for the neighborhood. She never once acknowledged that the property in question was mine, that I was standing on my own porch, dressed casually in my weekend clothes, doing absolutely nothing wrong. In her mind, she had rewritten the script, and I had somehow become the villain in a story she was directing. Her dramatic performance was punctuated by wild gestures and occasional glances around to see if the neighbors were watching. A few were now outside, some standing quietly with their arms crossed, others whispering to each other. It wasn't every day they saw the neighborhood enforcer go nuclear. Some knew me well enough to know this wasn't adding up, but others were clearly unsure what to believe. That uncertainty fueled Karen's confidence. The more she talked, the more convinced she became of her own delusion. She described me in terms carefully chosen to invoke fear: intimidating, possibly armed, refusing to cooperate, words meant to provoke a response. I could hear the dispatcher on speaker trying to get more information. Karen was pacing now, as if rehearsing lines in her head, repeating things like, "He doesn't belong here," and "He got aggressive when I asked questions." My blood boiled, but I stayed calm. Years in law enforcement had taught me that reacting emotionally in moments like this only gave people like her more ammunition. She wanted me to yell, to flinch, to give her even the smallest excuse to play the victim louder. I took a step forward to clarify things, holding up my hands in a non-threatening gesture. "Ma'am," I said firmly but respectfully, "this is my house. I live here. You are making a false report." But Karen just turned her back to me and waved me off like I was some nuisance. She spoke louder, over me, drowning out my words with more false claims to the dispatcher. "He's approaching me now," she said, panic suddenly dripping from her voice like she'd flipped a switch. "I don't feel safe. Please hurry." The manipulation was stunning. She was orchestrating a scene designed to escalate, hoping that by the time officers arrived, she'd have played the helpless victim so convincingly that my side of the story wouldn't matter. She was using the system not for justice but for personal revenge. It was no longer about HOA rules or lawn equipment or a shed. It had become a power trip. She wanted me out, humiliated, and punished for daring to stand up to her. I could see a neighbor across the street now filming with their phone. Good. I needed as much documentation as possible. This was the kind of thing that could spiral if left unchecked, and I wasn't about to become another headline because someone with a clipboard and too much time on her hands decided to weaponize emergency services for a personal vendetta. I stood my ground, didn't move, didn't raise my voice, just stayed steady and alert. Karen ended the call with a dramatic, "Please send someone fast. I'm scared," before shoving her phone into her purse with a huff. She crossed her arms and glared at me like she'd already won, like she believed the flashing lights were minutes away from validating her lies. Her breathing was heavy, her stance wide, like she was bracing for a confrontation that only existed in her head. She turned to the neighbors, speaking loudly enough for them to hear. "I've warned the HOA about him before," she declared. "He doesn't respect the rules. He thinks he's above the rest of us." I didn't respond. I didn't have to. The truth was on my side. But I knew better than to argue with someone mid-tantrum, especially someone who had no intention of listening. Let her dig the hole. Let her pile on the nonsense. I was just waiting for the moment she'd realize she wasn't the only one with authority in this situation. That the man she was trying to get arrested wasn't just a homeowner minding his business, but someone who understood the law far better than she did. As I stood there watching Karen bask in her imagined victory, I reached into my back pocket. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the steady calmness of someone who's done this 100 times before. I pulled out my wallet and opened it, revealing my badge and ID. Not a toy, not something I bought online, but the real deal, issued to me as an off-duty officer who had spent years in the field, dealing with everything from domestic disputes to tactical operations. Karen didn't notice at first. She was too busy feeding off the attention of the gathering neighbors, too locked into her narrative of control to realize her performance was about to collapse. I held the badge at my side, not to intimidate, but to be ready. The moment I heard the sirens in the distance, I knew I had to be 10 steps ahead. I wasn't about to let her fantasy spiral into a real-life mistake with life-altering consequences. It had happened before to good men in bad moments, caught off guard by lies that sounded real enough over a radio. I wasn't taking that chance. The scene she had staged was polished to a point. Frantic calls, exaggerated body language, the playbook of someone who thought emotion could overpower evidence. But the one thing she hadn't accounted for was who she was dealing with. Finally, her eyes flicked to my hands. She saw the badge. Her mouth paused mid-sentence, words failing her for just a heartbeat. "What is that supposed to be?" she said with a bitter scoff, trying to keep her grip on the narrative. "You can't just flash some fake badge and expect." I turned the badge slightly, letting the sunlight hit the gold and blue seal just enough for the clarity of it to sink in. The lettering was unmistakable. Official. Authorized. Real. That's when her voice cracked. I didn't say anything immediately. I wanted her to sit with it, to feel the sudden change in energy as the control she thought she had slipped away like sand through her fingers. The smug posture shrank, the shoulders pulled inward, and the frown that once radiated authority now trembled with hesitation. She opened her mouth again to say something. Maybe an excuse, maybe another accusation, but I raised my hand gently and cut her off. "I am a licensed law enforcement officer," I said plainly, "and right now, you are interfering with a private citizen on their own property and abusing emergency services with a knowingly false report." I said it calmly, factually. No yelling, no threats, just the truth. A few neighbors gasped audibly. The woman with the phone recording from across the street moved in closer, sensing the shift in the scene. Karen, for the first time in a long time, had no words. She looked down, then quickly back up, trying to regain footing. "I didn't know," she muttered, but the words lacked conviction. "You didn't identify yourself. How was I supposed to?" Again, I cut her off, this time with firmer words. "You assumed. You escalated. You lied to a 911 dispatcher and claimed I was trespassing when I was standing on my own porch. That's a serious offense." I watched as her bravado peeled away layer by layer. Her face flushed, not from heat but from the realization that she'd crossed a line she couldn't just walk back from with a fake apology or a new complaint. Her act had been based on the belief that no one would challenge her, that no one would have the authority or courage to push back. But here I was, standing calmly, lawfully, holding the badge she thought she could manipulate into showing up on her side. The sound of a cruiser approaching grew louder. Karen glanced toward the street, visibly panicking now. She reached for her purse again, this time fumbling with it like she didn't know what to do. "Maybe we can talk about this?" she whispered, barely audible, as if suddenly remembering how consequences work. I didn't respond. I just kept my badge visible and my stance firm. The truth didn't need backup. It was already enough to undo everything she'd tried to build in those frantic few minutes. The patrol car rolled up to the curb with a sharp, deliberate halt, its lights flashing a silent warning that things were about to get official. Karen straightened up immediately, trying to pull herself together as if she could still steer the narrative. But it was too late for that. The officers stepped out. Two of them. One was a younger patrolman, alert and observant, scanning the area with trained eyes. The other was someone I knew, Officer Hernandez. We had worked a joint task force together years ago, and though we hadn't crossed paths recently, the recognition was instant. He glanced around, noting Karen's rigid posture, the gathering of curious neighbors, and then his eyes landed on me. There was a brief pause, then a small nod. Not just a greeting, but a confirmation. He knew exactly who I was, and in that moment, the entire tone of the situation shifted. Karen, still unaware of our connection, stepped forward quickly, her voice trembling with urgency. "Officers, thank you for coming," she began, launching into a slightly revised version of her earlier 911 call. She left out the more extreme details this time, likely realizing how thin her story had become. This man was loitering, and I didn't feel safe. I tried to get him to leave, but he became confrontational. Hernandez didn't say a word to her at first. He kept his eyes on me, nodding slowly before speaking. "Afternoon, sir. Everything okay here?" His tone was respectful, casual even, but purposeful. Karen blinked, confused by his lack of urgency. I returned the nod and held up my badge again, letting him see it clearly. Afternoon, Hernandez. I live here. She made a false 911 call claiming I was trespassing. I kept my voice even, but made sure every word was sharp, clear, undeniable. That's when the younger officer stepped in, looking from me to Karen and back again. He was still putting the pieces together, watching the body language, the way the crowd of neighbors seemed to lean toward my side of the sidewalk. Karen tried again. You don't understand. He didn't tell me he was law enforcement. I thought. Hernandez turned to her finally, and the way he looked at her wasn't hostile. It was worse. It was official. He'd gone into investigation mode. Ma'am, did he ever step onto your property? He asked flatly. Karen hesitated. No, but... Did he threaten you in any way? No, but... Was he holding any weapons? Acting aggressively? No, but he wouldn't answer my questions. He was standing there like he had something to hide. That was it. The last sentence was the nail in the coffin. Her entire justification crumbled with those words. She hadn't witnessed a crime. She hadn't been endangered. She simply didn't like that I didn't react the way she wanted. Hernandez raised an eyebrow and then turned to his partner. Let's confirm identity, he said, though it was clear he already knew mine. Still, procedure had to be followed. I handed over my ID and badge. The younger officer took it, glanced it over, and within moments, nodded to Hernandez with a quiet, "All checks out." Karen's face was turning a different shade by the second. Her confidence evaporated. She tried to soften her tone, hoping to slide back into the role of the well-meaning neighbor. I didn't mean any harm. I've seen him around, and I thought maybe... Hernandez cut her off with a tone that was all business now. You thought wrong, ma'am, and you made a false emergency report based on that assumption. The silence was suffocating. Karen looked like she wanted to crawl out of her own skin. Neighbors whispered audibly now, some shaking their heads. She glanced at them, then back at the officers, as if begging for someone to bail her out. But no one moved. She was alone in the mess she had created. The younger officer handed back my ID and badge with a respectful nod. Thank you, sir. Sorry for the trouble. I nodded back, no grudge in my tone, but no sympathy either. I wasn't going to downplay the seriousness of what had happened. Karen took a small step back, visibly shaken. Her arms were no longer crossed in defiance. Her whole posture had changed. Meek, quiet, uncertain. The dominance she once wore like armor had completely vanished. She no longer looked like the HOA authority figure who thought she ruled the block. She looked like someone realizing too late that her actions had real-world consequences. Karen's reaction to the arrival of the patrol car was almost theatrical. She instantly straightened up, adjusted her sunglasses, and strode toward the officers like she had summoned them as backup in some neighborhood crusade. Her voice shifted into that brittle, overly composed tone she used when trying to sound professional, like she was filing a complaint at a boutique rather than accusing someone of a crime. Officers, she began, motioning toward me without even glancing in my direction. Thank goodness you're here. I've tried everything to de-escalate this, but he just won't leave. Her performance would have been more convincing if the officers hadn't already begun sizing up the situation with the trained eyes of people who had seen far too many false alarms. The younger officer kept his hand near his belt, not in a threatening way but with caution. The older one, Officer Hernandez, didn't look at Karen at all. His eyes locked directly onto me, and after a moment, recognition sparked across his face. We'd worked together briefly on a multi-agency operation about 6 years earlier. It wasn't a close relationship, but it was enough. I gave him a respectful nod and held up my badge again, clear and level. No need for words yet. The moment spoke for itself. Hernandez's eyes narrowed slightly, reading the badge, confirming what he already suspected. Karen was still talking. He's been standing on the porch for over 15 minutes, refusing to move. I asked him calmly to explain why he was here, and he became defensive. I felt I had no choice. Hernandez finally looked at her, calm but firm. "Ma'am, are you saying this man is on your property?" Karen faltered slightly. "Well, no, he's on that property," she said, pointing to my porch. "But I didn't recognize him. He didn't identify himself. He had some kind of badge, but it's his house," Hernandez cut in. "This is his residence." There was a visible stutter in her next breath. "Well, how was I supposed to know that?" "You could have asked," I said, still standing calmly, hands visible, no aggression. "You could have waited for a bored response. Instead, you called 911 and said I was trespassing on my own land." Karen shook her head quickly, trying to reverse the narrative. "I never said it was his land. I said there was someone I didn't recognize, and I was concerned for safety. That's what the HOA expects me to do." "I'm off-duty law enforcement, Karen," I said quietly. "You've known me for 2 years. I live here. You've driven past me while I was watering this lawn." Her mouth opened, then closed again. The mask was cracking. The younger officer stepped forward now and took a look at my ID and badge, nodding slowly. "Everything checks out," he said to Hernandez. "No violations, no trespassing, no threats reported from any other witnesses." Hernandez's tone shifted now, firm and unmistakably official. "Ma'am, do you understand that making a false report to 911 is a criminal offense?" Karen looked stunned. "What? No, I wasn't lying. I didn't know. I was doing what I thought was right for the community. This neighborhood has guidelines. We're supposed to report suspicious activity." "There's a difference between suspicion and fabrication," Hernandez said. "You didn't just report something unusual. You accused this man of trespassing and implied he was a threat. You escalated a civil issue into a law enforcement matter without basis. That's abuse of emergency services." A murmur rippled through the few neighbors who had gathered. Some already had their phones out. One woman from 2 houses down shook her head and muttered, "She's always doing this." The younger officer glanced at the crowd, his jaw tightening. False reports weren't just a waste of resources, they could get people hurt. And in this case, it almost did. Karen's voice shrank. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't know he was a cop. I thought he was someone the HOA hadn't cleared. I don't need to be cleared to stand on my own property," I said, my voice steady. "And you knew enough about me to know this wasn't some stranger from out of town. This wasn't about safety, it was about control." She looked at me, her expression finally beginning to register something close to guilt, though it still warred with pride and denial. Her shoulders slumped, her confident posture from earlier gone. The clipboard she always carried was now hanging limply at her side. For once, there were no more checklists to hide behind, no more bylaws to misquote, no more neighbors to impress. As the patrol car idled at the curb, the flashing lights reflected across nearby windows, casting red and blue hues on the otherwise quiet suburban street. Karen took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders like she was about to testify in court. She turned and marched toward the arriving officers with a sense of righteous purpose, waving them over like she was in charge of the whole situation. Her words came quickly, trying to control the story before anyone else could speak. "Thank you for coming, officers," she said, her voice pitched for drama. "I've been trying to handle this civilly, but he just refuses to leave. He's been acting suspiciously. I had no choice but to call this in." The 2 officers stepped out calmly, eyes scanning the scene. One looked to be in his mid-30s, tall, composed, observant. The other, slightly older, paused when he spotted me standing on the porch. His expression changed just subtly, recognition, not alarm. "Officer Hernandez." We'd worked together briefly in the past, and while we weren't close, we'd shared enough professional overlap for mutual respect. He gave me the faintest nod, then turned his attention back to Karen, letting her continue her embellished account of events. She gestured toward my house, pointing with that same clipboard she always carried like it was a badge of authority. "I told him he wasn't allowed to be here. He wouldn't give me any identification. And when I asked him to leave, he got confrontational," she said, crossing her arms with practiced indignation. It's people like this who make our community unsafe. Hernandez didn't react. He simply let her talk, which seemed to rattle her more than interrupting would have. Then he looked at me, his expression calm but focused. "You good?" he asked simply. I nodded once and held up my badge again, letting him take a clear look. He stepped closer and examined it, then glanced at my driver's license. Within seconds, the situation shifted. The posture, the questions, the tension. It all softened in him. But not for her. Karen took a half step forward, still clinging to her version of the story. "Wait, what's going on? Why are you looking at his ID? I'm the one who called." Hernandez didn't even answer her. He turned to the younger officer, handed him the credentials, and motioned for him to run a quick verification. The younger officer nodded and stepped aside to make the call. Karen looked back and forth between them, clearly sensing her control of the moment slipping. "He didn't even tell me he lived here," she snapped, her voice climbing. "How was I supposed to know? Anyone can walk onto someone's porch and claim they belong." "That's a fair question," Hernandez said, his voice even. "So I'll ask you one now. Did he enter your property?" "No, but..." "Did he threaten you in any way?" "No, but he didn't explain himself. He just stood there. That's not normal behavior." Hernandez gave her a long look. "It's not illegal either. Not if he's on his own property, which he is. And by the way, he doesn't need to explain himself to you. You're not law enforcement." Karen bristled. "I'm on the HOA board. I was elected by the neighborhood. I have responsibilities. HOA board positions don't give you the legal authority to question residents, demand ID, or call 911 unless there's a legitimate threat. Are you aware of that?" I thought I was doing the right thing," she said, the confidence finally breaking from her voice. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Just then, the younger officer returned, handing the badge and ID back to me. "Everything checks out. He's listed as the property owner. Off-duty, but fully verified." He looked at Karen next, and though he didn't say it, the disappointment was clear in his eyes. Karen's arms slowly dropped to her sides. Her mouth opened like she wanted to argue, but the words never came. The crowd of neighbors who had gathered by now remained silent, a few whispering behind their hands. One elderly man from across the street shook his head in disbelief. Another woman from the corner house whispered to her teenage daughter. Both staring at Karen like this wasn't the first time she'd stirred up unnecessary drama. Karen shifted uncomfortably, glancing around, realizing how isolated she'd become in a matter of minutes. Hernandez stepped toward her, lowering his voice but still firm. "You need to understand something. False 911 calls drain resources and create dangerous situations. We didn't just stroll over here. We responded to a potential trespass and public safety call. That's not something we take lightly." Karen nodded quickly, eyes darting to the officers, then to me, and finally to the watching neighbors, her silence louder than anything she could have said. The tension hung thick in the air, though the threat had long passed. Karen, once fiery and assertive, now stood with her arms crossed in a self-protective way, her shoulders hunched slightly as if shrinking under the weight of her own actions. The crowd of neighbors, once quiet observers, had shifted. Their eyes weren't on me anymore. They were on her. The murmurs, the looks of disapproval, and the subtle head shakes were no longer silent. They were collective judgment from a community that had grown tired of her self-appointed authority and endless crusades under the banner of the HOA. For years, she had used her position to intimidate, to nitpick, to issue warnings like a meter made with a personal vendetta. Today, she finally found the limit. Hernandez didn't look angry, just tired. The kind of tired you see in people who've handled one too many situations that never should have escalated in the first place. He looked back at me for a moment, giving me that silent, familiar glance only cops give each other when a situation has been neutralized but still smells like a mess. He turned back toward Karen, his voice low but loaded with finality. "I'm going to file this call as a false report," he said. "There's a record of the audio. The dispatcher's logs show what you claimed. If this happens again, it won't be a warning. Karen's mouth parted like she wanted to argue, but the words died before they could form. She glanced at the younger officer, hoping for some kind of backup, but he was already looking past her. There was nothing left for her to say. The air around her had gone from empowered to exposed, and now she was just standing there hoping this would all disappear. But it wouldn't. Not this time. I stepped off the porch slowly, not in a showy or confrontational way, just enough to meet the officers halfway and shake hands. It wasn't necessary, but it made a statement. I belonged here. I had nothing to hide, and I wasn't the one who needed to explain myself to the neighborhood. The younger officer gave me a respectful nod and a small apology. "Sorry for the trouble, sir," he said. "You handled that better than most would have." I nodded once. I appreciated it, but it wasn't about praise. It was about clarity and making sure this kind of behavior didn't go unchecked. Karen still hadn't moved. Her clipboard hung limply in one hand, like she didn't know what to do with it anymore. It had been her weapon of choice for so long, backed by rules, checklists, and the illusion of power. Now it just looked like a cheap piece of plastic that couldn't protect her from her own decisions. She opened her mouth again, quieter this time. "I didn't mean to make it worse," she muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. "I thought I was helping." I looked at her, not with anger, but with a kind of tired disappointment. "You didn't ask. You assumed. You called the police on a neighbor you've known for years. You weaponized the badge you don't carry against the one I do." The words weren't meant to be cruel, just honest. I didn't need to scream at her or demand an apology. The facts spoke louder than any lecture could. From the corner of my eye, I saw one of the neighbors filming slowly lower their phone, their expression unchanged. The footage was already out there. Whether it ended up online or not didn't matter. The story had already spread, and Karen's credibility, it had cracked wide open in front of everyone. This wasn't the first time she'd overstepped. It was just the first time someone stood up and pushed back with the law itself in hand. Hernandez gave one last look around and signaled to his partner. Their job was done here and they had calls to return to. Before leaving, he turned back to Karen. "I suggest you reflect on what just happened," he said flatly. "Because next time, we won't be walking away with just a conversation." She nodded numbly, her gaze downcast. As the squad car pulled away, the flashing lights fading into the distance, the crowd slowly began to disperse. The drama was over, but the consequences were only just beginning. Karen didn't follow them. She just stood there in the middle of the street, no longer the center of command, but the subject of a hard lesson in boundaries, truth, and accountability. Karen stood frozen on the edge of the lawn, her posture hollowed out, stripped of the authority she once paraded through the neighborhood like a badge. The same people she used to rally with newsletters and group emails were now backing away slowly, their expressions a mix of discomfort and silent satisfaction. She was no longer the voice of the HOA. She was the example of what happens when power is misused. And now, with 2 officers as witnesses, camera footage from several neighbors, and a formal police record of her false emergency report, I had every right and every legal basis to move forward. I walked back up the porch steps slowly, retrieved the folder that held the HOA permits she'd claimed I didn't have, and brought them back down without urgency. I held them out toward the younger officer, who looked them over quickly before passing them to Hernandez. "Approved 6 months ago," Hernandez said, flipping through them. "No violations. All documented." Then he handed them back to me with a nod that said more than words could. He knew I wasn't just in the right. I had been calm, collected, and patient despite being provoked on my own property. Karen finally spoke again, barely above a whisper. "You're not seriously pressing charges, right?" There was a crack in her voice that hadn't been there before, a hint of real fear. Not for her safety, but for her reputation, her standing in the HOA, and what would come next. I didn't answer her immediately. I looked around at the witnesses, the neighbors whose trust she had once taken for granted. Some of them were still standing nearby, waiting to see what I would do. Then I took a step forward and pulled a citation form from my folder. Not because I needed it, but because I wanted her to understand that this wasn't going to disappear quietly. I turned back to the officers. I'd like to file a formal complaint for false reporting and harassment. This isn't the first time she's tried this with me, but it's the first time it's gone this far. Hernandez nodded. We'll include it in the report and forward it to the city attorney. Karen's breath hitched. She looked stunned, maybe even betrayed by the process she had weaponized so many times in the past. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. There was nothing left to defend. Everything she had accused me of had collapsed in front of a uniformed audience. The 911 call had been reckless, unfounded, and dangerous. If I hadn't been who I was, if I hadn't kept my cool, or if I had reacted emotionally, this entire scenario could have gone another way, and Karen would have walked away blaming the system for her mistake. But this time she wasn't walking away. Not without accountability. Hernandez made the call, speaking into his radio to log the incident as a verified false emergency report. He took Karen's name, her statement, and the conflicting evidence already provided by witnesses. The other officer began drafting the official report, pausing only to ask me for a copy of my permit documentation to attach to the case file. I handed it over without a word. Everything was in order. It always had been. Karen, for the first time since the beginning, looked at me with something that resembled vulnerability. "Please," she said, her voice nearly cracking. "You know I didn't mean any harm. We can settle this without making it official, right?" But it was already official. The moment she picked up that phone and deliberately misled emergency services to remove someone she personally disliked, she crossed a line. And now that line came with consequences. I didn't say anything more to her. I simply turned to Hernandez, who finished the paperwork and handed me a copy. "You'll be contacted by the city office next week. Let us know if she contacts you again in the meantime." I nodded and thanked them both. As the officers stepped away and began walking back toward their cruiser, the last of the neighbors dispersed. Some offered small nods of support. Others looked toward Karen with disappointment. Karen stood alone now, her clipboard forgotten in the grass, her sunglasses removed, revealing eyes that no longer held the fire of confrontation. What remained was someone who thought she understood power, only to discover that real authority comes with restraint, proof, and principle. Not a clipboard, not a title, and certainly not the sound of sirens summoned out of spite. 11.